The invitation arrived like a quiet mistake, too elegant, too deliberate, and far too late to be innocent. Stay with me, because what happened next turned a private humiliation into a public reckoning that no one in that room was prepared for. At exactly 7:42 p.m., under the soft glow of crystal chandeliers in a Manhattan ballroom, Emily Carter stood alone near the back wall, one hand resting gently against the curve of her 7-month pregnancy, the other holding a cream-colored envelope that had already changed everything. The paper was thick, expensive, the kind her husband, Daniel Whitmore, once said was only for people who matter. Tonight, it carried his name, and another woman's. Emily didn't cry. Not anymore. Not after the months of silence, the late-night meetings that stretched into early mornings, the subtle shift in tone when Daniel spoke to her like she was an obligation instead of a partner. The room hummed with polite conversation, the clinking of glasses, the low murmur of deals being made, and alliances quietly reinforced. This was his world. She used to believe it was hers too. A server passed by offering sparkling water. Emily declined with a small, controlled smile. Her doctor had told her to avoid stress, to keep her heart rate steady, to think of the baby first. She had followed every instruction, except one. She came tonight, because 2 days ago, that envelope appeared at her door, hand-delivered, no return address. Inside, a formal invitation to a private engagement announcement. Daniel Whitmore and Vanessa Hale request the honor of your presence. No explanation, no apology, just a date, a time, and a location Emily knew all too well, because she helped design the guest list for events exactly like this. For a moment, she almost didn't come. She almost chose silence again. But then something shifted. Maybe it was the baby moving, a quiet reminder that she was no longer alone. Maybe it was the memory of who she used to be before she became invisible in her own marriage. Or maybe it was the email she received just hours after the invitation. No subject line, just one sentence. You deserve to see the truth tonight. Emily didn't know who sent it, but she listened. Across the room, Daniel laughed. The same laugh that once felt warm now echoed differently. Sharper, distant, practiced. Vanessa stood beside him, flawless in a tailored white dress, her hand resting lightly on his arm as if it had always belonged there. People were watching them, admiring them, believing the story they were being shown. Emily adjusted her posture, shoulders back, chin slightly raised. She wasn't dressed to impress, just a simple navy dress, low heels, nothing that demanded attention. And yet, something about her presence felt intentional, grounded, like she wasn't here to compete. She was here to witness, and maybe to reveal. At 8 p.m. sharp, the lights dimmed slightly. A subtle cue. Conversation softened. All eyes turned toward the center of the room, where Daniel stepped forward, confident, composed. Every inch the man who controlled outcomes for a living. Thank you all for being here tonight, he began, voice smooth, measured. This is a new chapter, one built on clarity, on honesty, on moving forward. Emily's fingers tightened slightly around the envelope. Honesty. The word lingered in the air like a challenge. Because somewhere between the polished speeches and the curated smiles, there was a version of the truth no one had heard yet. And as the room leaned in, waiting for celebration, something else was already unfolding, quiet, precise, and impossible to stop. Some men build their empires on silence. They just never expected to be broken by the one person they thought would never speak. Emily did not move when the applause began, but she felt it, a soft wave of approval rolling across the room as Daniel reached for Vanessa's hand and lifted it slightly. A gesture so polished it might have been rehearsed a dozen times in front of a mirror. And for a brief second, Emily remembered the first time he held her hand like that, years ago, in a smaller room, with fewer witnesses and far more sincerity. Back when promises sounded like truth instead of strategy, back when she believed. She was building a life instead of slowly being written out of one. And yet here she stood, not shattered, not even surprised, just awake. Because something about tonight felt different, like a door had quietly opened behind the scenes, and whatever was hidden was about to step into the light. And then her phone vibrated once in her hand, subtle, almost polite, but enough to break the illusion, and she glanced down, expecting nothing, maybe a calendar reminder or a message from a concerned friend. but instead she saw a new notification from an unknown sender. No name, no number, just a file attachment and a single line of text that read, "Play this when he says the word future." And for a moment her breath slowed, not from fear, but from recognition, because this was not random. This was intentional, timed, precise, and somewhere in the rhythm of Daniel's voice as he continued speaking about growth and alignment and shared vision. She realized that whoever sent this knew exactly how this night would unfold, and that meant one thing. She was not the only one who had been watching. Across the room, Vanessa leaned closer to Daniel, whispering something that made him smile in a way Emily had not seen in months. A curated smile, careful, almost performative, and the guests leaned in, drawn by the promise of a reveal, an announcement, something celebratory, something final, and Emily's fingers hovered over the screen, not pressing play yet, not rushing, because for the first time in a long time she was not reacting, she was choosing. And the baby shifted again, a gentle reminder, steady, grounding, and she exhaled. Slowly, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, almost unreadable, as if she had already stepped outside the version of herself that once needed answers, and now only needed truth. Daniel's voice grew slightly louder as he approached the center of his speech, the part where he would define what came next, where he would shape the narrative in a way that left no room for questions, and that was when he said it. Our future, simple, confident, absolute, and Emily pressed play, not dramatically, not with any visible reaction, just a quiet tap, and for a split second nothing happened, just the ambient sound of the room, the soft hum of anticipation, and then from somewhere near the front, a screen flickered to life, subtle at first, like a technical adjustment, but then the audio shifted, just slightly, just enough for people to notice that something was off, that the script had been interrupted, and Emily did not look up immediately. She did not need to, because she already knew that whatever was about to unfold was no longer under Daniel's control, and in a room built on appearances. That was the one thing no one knew how to recover from. The first voice that filled the room was not Daniel's, and that was the moment everything changed, because instead of the confident tone people expected, the speakers carried a recorded conversation, low at first, almost indistinguishable from background noise, until a few heads turned, and the room instinctively quieted, the kind of silence that spreads when something feels wrong, but no one wants to be the first to say it out loud. And then the words became clear, unmistakably Daniel's voice. Casual, unguarded, speaking in a way that did not belong on a stage. We just need to keep everything separate until the announcement. It is cleaner that way. Followed by a second voice, softer, unmistakably Vanessa, asking a question that hung in the air longer than anyone expected. And Emily, what about her? And there it was, the name, spoken not with respect or even hesitation, but as a logistical detail, a variable to be managed, and Emily did not look at them, not yet, because she already knew that the power of this moment was not in confrontation. It was in exposure, the kind that required no raised voice, no dramatic gesture, just the quiet collapse of a carefully built narrative. Across the ballroom, Daniel's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the kind of micro-reaction only someone who knew him well would notice, a tightening around the eyes, a pause in his posture, as if his mind was recalculating faster than his body could respond, and Vanessa's hand slipped slightly from his arm, not dramatically, just enough to suggest uncertainty, because this was not part of the plan. This was not something that could be redirected with a smile or a well-placed sentence. The recording continued, each sentence landing heavier than the last, discussing timelines, appearances, the importance of maintaining a certain image until contracts were finalized, language that sounded professional until it became personal, until it revealed a version of the truth that did not match the one being presented on stage. And around them the guests began to shift, subtle at first, glances exchanged, whispers forming at the edges of conversations. Because people in that room understood leverage, they understood risk, and more importantly, they understood when something had just changed the value of everything. Emily finally lifted her gaze, not toward Daniel, but toward the screen, watching the reflection of a story unravel in real time. And for the first time that night, she felt something settle inside her, not anger, not even sadness, but clarity, the kind that arrives when all the pieces finally align. And she realized that this was never about proving anything to him. It was about no longer allowing herself to be rewritten by him. Daniel stepped forward slightly, attempting to regain control, his voice cutting in just enough to try and reframe the moment. But it did not land the same way anymore, because once people hear the truth in its raw form, polished words lose their weight, and Emily remained exactly where she was, grounded, steady, one hand resting gently where new life quietly continued, untouched by the noise of the room. Because while Daniel had built his future on controlled narratives, Emily had just stepped into something far more powerful, a moment where truth did not need permission to be heard. The room did not erupt into chaos, not immediately, and that was what made it more unsettling, because instead of loud reactions there was a quiet recalibration happening in real time, the kind that powerful people make when they realize the story they believed no longer holds. And Daniel felt it before he could fully process it, the subtle shift of attention away from him. The way eyes no longer followed his movements with admiration but with evaluation, and he cleared his throat once. Controlled, measured, stepping forward again as if proximity alone could restore authority. There seems to be a misunderstanding, he began, his voice steady but no longer effortless. And for a brief moment it almost worked, because confidence has a way of filling gaps before facts catch up. But then the recording resumed, not louder, not more aggressive, just clearer, sharper, revealing another layer of conversation that no one in that room could ignore, references to timing, to legal positioning, to keeping certain financial arrangements undisclosed until after specific milestones were reached, language that did not belong in a celebration, language that belonged in strategy rooms and private negotiations. And Vanessa's posture changed, subtle but undeniable, her shoulders tightening just slightly, as if she suddenly understood that this was no longer a shared performance, but a shared exposure. And she glanced at Daniel not for reassurance but for answers, answers he did not seem ready to give. Emily watched it unfold without moving, without interrupting, because this was never about overpowering him. It was about allowing the truth to complete its own sentence, and the guests began to shift more openly now, small conversations forming, phones discreetly checking messages, because in a room like this information travels faster than sound, and what they were hearing was not just personal, it was consequential. Daniel attempted again, stepping closer to the center, his tone slightly firmer now. "This audio is taken out of context," he said, and there it was, the first crack, not in his words but in his control, because context requires trust, and trust had just been quietly dismantled. And then something else happened, something even more precise. The screen behind him changed again, not abruptly, but with a smooth transition, revealing documents, timelines, emails, each one appearing just long enough to be recognized, not enough to be debated. And Emily knew then that this was never a single moment. It was a sequence, designed, intentional, and whoever had set this in motion understood exactly how to move a room without raising their voice. Vanessa took a small step back, not away from Daniel entirely, but enough to create distance that had not been there before, and that distance spoke louder than any statement she could have made, because alignment is easy when everything is controlled, but when control slips even slightly, people reveal where they truly stand. Emily finally shifted her weight, a small movement, almost imperceptible, but it marked a change, not in the room, but in her, because she was no longer observing from the edge. She was part of the moment now, not as a victim, not even as an opponent, but as someone who had chosen to stand still while everything else moved. And in that stillness, there was something far more powerful than reaction. There was certainty, and Daniel, for the first time that night, looked directly at her, not with anger, not even with accusation, but with something far less familiar, something that did not belong in his usual vocabulary of control. He looked uncertain, and in a world where he had built his identity on always knowing the next move, that uncertainty was louder than anything the speakers could have played. It was not the screen, not the audio, not even the shifting weight of the room that changed everything next. It was a single voice from the back, calm, measured, and completely uninvited. "You might want to let it finish, Daniel." And the tone carried something different, not curiosity, not gossip, but authority, the kind that does not need to be announced to be recognized. And several heads turned at once as a man stepped forward from the edge of the crowd, mid-50s, composed, wearing nothing that demanded attention, yet somehow drawing all of it. And Daniel's posture tightened again, not visibly to most, but enough for Emily to notice, because she had spent years learning the difference between his confidence and his control, and this was neither. This was calculation under pressure. The man did not rush, did not raise his voice. He simply walked into the light as the screen behind Daniel shifted once more, revealing a header that several people in the room immediately recognized, a firm name, a legal watermark, something official enough to silence the remaining whispers without a single command. And the man continued, "These are not fragments, these are complete records." And he did not look at Emily. Not yet. His focus remained on Daniel, as if the entire room had narrowed to a single point, time-stamped, verified, and already filed where they need to be. And there it was, the shift from embarrassment to consequence. Because embarrassment can be managed, redirected, smoothed over with language, but consequence has weight, and that weight had just entered the room without asking permission. Vanessa's composure finally faltered, not dramatically, not enough to draw sympathy, but enough to expose something real beneath the surface. A quick glance at the screen, then at Daniel, then away again, as if recalculating her position in a story that was no longer stable. And Emily felt it too, not as shock, but as confirmation, because deep down she had already sensed that tonight was not random. It was coordinated, layered, precise. And now the final layer was stepping into place. The man finally turned his gaze toward her, just briefly, a quiet acknowledgement, not of victory, not even of alliance, but of alignment, as if to say this was never about spectacle, it was about completion. And Daniel spoke again. But this time there was a difference, not in volume, not in clarity, but in intention. "This is unnecessary," he said, choosing his words carefully. "We can resolve this privately." And the man almost smiled, not with amusement, but with recognition, because that was the language Daniel had always relied on. Private resolutions, controlled outcomes, conversations behind closed doors where narratives could be adjusted and consequences minimized. But this was not that kind of room anymore, and the man shook his head once, subtle, final. "It has already moved beyond private," he replied, and the simplicity of that sentence carried more weight than any argument could have, because it was not a threat, it was a fact, and facts do not negotiate. Emily took a slow breath, steady, grounded, her hand still, resting gently where life continued, unaffected by contracts, by reputations, by any of the things that had once defined her place in this world. And for the first time that night, she stepped forward, not to confront, not to accuse, just one step, enough to be seen not as part of the past Daniel was trying to erase, but as the present he could no longer ignore. And the room, already quiet, seemed to hold that silence just a second longer, because everyone understood that whatever came next would not be controlled, not by wealth, not by influence, not by carefully chosen words, but by something far simpler and far more difficult to contain. The truth, standing in plain sight, no longer waiting to be acknowledged. For a moment no one spoke, not because they did not have something to say, but because they understood that anything said too quickly would belong to the old version of the room, the version where Daniel still controlled the narrative. And that version was already gone, and Emily felt that shift settle fully now, not as tension, but as something quieter, something steady, like the moment after a long storm when the air becomes clear enough to finally see what remains. And she lifted her gaze to meet Daniel's directly, not challenging, not pleading, simply present. And that presence carried more weight than any accusation ever could, because it forced him to stand inside the reality he had been avoiding. And he took a breath as if preparing to speak again. But the words did not come as easily this time, because every sentence now had to pass through the awareness that the room was no longer listening for confidence. It was listening for truth, and that is a very different audience. Vanessa shifted her stance again, creating just a little more distance, enough that it could not be explained away as coincidence, and she smoothed the fabric of her dress, a small, controlled motion, but one that revealed how quickly alignment can dissolve when certainty disappears. And the man who had stepped forward earlier remained still, not intervening, not directing, simply allowing the moment to unfold exactly as it needed to. Because this was not about forcing an outcome, it was about removing the illusion that had been holding one in place. And Emily took another step forward, slow, deliberate, her heels barely making a sound against the polished floor, and as she moved, the room adjusted with her, subtle shifts in attention, in posture, in expectation, because people were no longer watching a presentation, they were witnessing a turning point, and when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, even, not raised, not rushed. "I did not come here to interrupt your future," she said, each word clear, measured. "I came here to understand it." And the simplicity of that sentence cut through everything that had been said before, because it removed blame, removed emotion, and left only clarity. And Daniel looked at her, as if seeing her fully for the first time that night, not as an obstacle, not as a detail to be managed, but as someone who had chosen not to disappear, and that choice changed everything, because it meant he could no longer define the terms alone. The screen behind him remained still now, no longer adding new information, because it did not need to. The essential truth had already been revealed, and what remained was what each person would do with it. The guests stood in quiet attention, no longer whispering, no longer checking their phones, because something more significant than information was unfolding, something about accountability, about presence, about the cost of building something without honesty at its foundation. And Emily's hand rested gently against her side again, steady, grounded, and in that moment it became clear that she was not here to take anything from him. She was here to take something back from herself, something that had been slowly diminished over time. And Daniel finally spoke again. But this time his voice carried none of the practiced certainty it once did, only the weight of a man realizing that control is not the same as truth. And as the silence stretched just a second longer, the room understood what he was only beginning to see, that some stories do not end when they are rewritten. They end when someone decides to stop being edited out of them. Daniel did not answer immediately, and that hesitation carried more meaning than any explanation he could have offered, because for the first time in a room designed for certainty, he did not have a clear path forward, and Emily could see it in the way his posture held just a fraction too still, in the way his eyes searched not for dominance but for direction, and the silence between them was no longer uncomfortable. It was revealing. It stretched just long enough for everyone present to understand that something fundamental had shifted, and then Vanessa spoke, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a tone that carried its own kind of precision. "Daniel," she said, and her voice did not ask for reassurance. It asked for clarity, and that distinction mattered, because in that single word she was no longer aligning herself with his version of events. She was asking where she stood within the truth that had just surfaced, and Daniel turned slightly toward her, as if trying to reassemble the structure that had just come undone. But the timing was no longer his to control. The room had moved past that point, and the man near the front remained silent, observing, allowing each person to reveal themselves through their choices rather than their statements. Emily watched the exchange without interruption, because she understood something now that she had not fully understood before. That control does not collapse all at once. It erodes in moments like this, in pauses, in questions that cannot be answered quickly enough, in alliances that begin to loosen at the edges. And Vanessa took another small step back, not out of fear, but out of recognition, because whatever this had been, whatever story she believed she was stepping into, it was no longer stable, and people in her world did not stay where stability was uncertain. Daniel exhaled slowly, a controlled release, and when he finally spoke again, his voice carried a different weight, not authority, not persuasion, but something closer to negotiation. "This is not the full picture," he said, and the words felt thinner now, less grounded, because the room had already seen enough to understand the pattern, and patterns are harder to deny than isolated moments. Emily tilted her head slightly, not dismissive, not confrontational, just attentive, as if she were giving him the space to continue. And that gesture alone shifted the dynamic again, because she was no longer reacting to him. She was allowing him to reveal himself, and that is a position few people know how to navigate when they are used to leading. The guests remained still, drawn into the gravity of the moment, because what they were witnessing was not just a personal unraveling. It was a recalibration of power, the kind that happens quietly but changes everything that follows. And Emily finally spoke again, her voice steady, composed. "Then tell it," she said, simple, direct, leaving no room for interpretation. And in that invitation there was no hostility, only expectation, and expectation requires substance, not performance. And Daniel held her gaze for a moment longer than before, as if realizing that whatever he said next would not just be heard, it would be remembered, measured against what had already been revealed, and the space between them felt different now, not like a divide, but like a threshold. Something that once crossed could not be undone, and Vanessa's eyes moved between them, calculating, reassessing, because this was no longer about alignment with Daniel. It was about positioning within a truth that had already begun to settle, and Emily remained exactly where she was, grounded, present, her hand resting gently as a quiet reminder of what actually mattered beyond the room, beyond the contracts, beyond the carefully constructed narratives. And in that stillness, she held something that no one else in that space could replicate. Not wealth, not influence, not control, but clarity. And clarity has a way of making everything else feel temporary. And as the silence lingered just 1 second longer, the room understood that whatever came next would not be guided by who had the most power, but by who was willing to stand inside the truth without trying to reshape it. Daniel held the silence for 1 second too long. And in a room trained to read timing as language, that delay said everything he was trying not to admit, because confidence speaks quickly while uncertainty measures every word. And when he finally moved, it was not forward, not toward Emily, but slightly to the side, a subtle shift that suggested he was no longer addressing her alone but the room itself, as if appealing to a broader audience might restore the balance he had lost. "There are things," he began, carefully, deliberately, "that are structured for reasons people here would understand." And the choice of words was intentional, reaching for familiarity, for alignment, for the shared language of strategy and discretion that usually worked in his favor. But tonight it landed differently, because the room was no longer looking for reasons, it was looking for truth, and Emily saw it clearly now, the difference between explanation and accountability, and she did not interrupt, did not challenge, she simply remained still, allowing his words to unfold fully without resistance. Because resistance would have given him something to push against, something to reshape, and she was done giving him that. Vanessa's expression tightened just slightly, not in confusion, but in calculation, because she recognized the shift as well, the moment when a narrative stops convincing even the person telling it. And she crossed her arms loosely, not defensive, but no longer aligned. A physical signal that the partnership being presented was already unraveling beneath the surface. The man near the front finally moved again, not stepping closer, but turning slightly toward the screen as if to acknowledge what had already been shown, and his voice remained calm when he spoke. "Structures can be explained," he said, evenly, "but intent is harder to redefine." And that sentence landed with quiet precision, not dramatic, not confrontational, but undeniable, because intent does not depend on context once it has been revealed. And Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the smallest fracture in a persona built on control, and Emily felt something shift inside her again, not because of what he said, but because of what he could no longer say. The absence of certainty where it once dominated, and she took a slow breath, grounding herself, her hand resting gently as the steady rhythm of life beneath it continued, untouched by contracts, untouched by image, untouched by the quiet negotiations that had defined so much of her past. And for a brief moment the room seemed to hold its breath with her, as if waiting for something more, something final. But Emily did not rush to fill the space, because she understood now that closure does not come from winning an argument. It comes from no longer needing one. And Daniel looked at her again, this time without searching, without recalculating, just looking, as if trying to understand how the person he once controlled had become someone he could not predict. And Vanessa shifted once more, stepping fully out of alignment. Now, her distance no longer subtle, her silence no longer supportive, because in a world built on advantage, clarity changes loyalty faster than any promise ever could. The guests remained still, but their attention had shifted completely, no longer divided, no longer curious, but settled, because they had seen enough to understand the outcome even before it was spoken, and Emily finally moved again, not closer, not away, just enough to reposition herself within the space, a quiet reclaiming of presence. And when she spoke, her voice carried no anger, no urgency, only certainty. "You built something that required me to disappear," she said, each word measured, steady. "And tonight you finally saw what happens when I do not." And there was no need for more, because the sentence did not accuse, it concluded. And in that conclusion, there was nothing left for him to reshape, nothing left for him to control. Only the reality of what had already been revealed, standing in the open, no longer waiting for permission to exist. No one applauded this time, and that absence felt more definitive than any reaction could have been, because applause belongs to performances, and what stood in the room now was no longer a performance. It was the quiet aftermath of something real, something that could not be edited or reframed, and Daniel did not speak again, not because he had nothing to say, but because he understood, perhaps for the first time, that anything he added would only diminish what had already been revealed. And Emily felt that realization settle across the room like a final note that did not need to be repeated, and she turned slightly, not away in defeat, not in retreat, but with a calm sense of completion, as if the purpose that brought her there had already been fulfilled without needing further explanation. And the man near the front gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not of victory, not of approval, but of acknowledgement, the kind exchanged between people who understand that some outcomes do not require celebration, only recognition. And Vanessa exhaled slowly, her posture no longer aligned with the narrative she had stepped into, her distance now unmistakable, because clarity has a way of dissolving illusions faster than any confrontation ever could. And the guests began to shift again, but this time with intention, quiet conversations forming, not about speculation, but about consequence. Because in a room like this, people do not just witness moments, they calculate what those moments mean. And Emily walked forward, not toward Daniel, not toward the center, but past it, her steps steady, measured, each one carrying her further away from a version of her life that no longer defined her. And as she moved, the room made space without being asked, a subtle recognition that she was no longer someone on the margins of the story. She was the one who had changed its direction, and Daniel remained where he stood, still, composed on the surface, but no longer the center of gravity he had once been, because control without trust does not hold its shape for long. And when it collapses, it does so quietly, without spectacle, without warning, just a gradual realization that what once seemed solid was always dependent on something fragile. And Emily reached the edge of the ballroom and paused for a brief moment, not to look back, not to measure what she was leaving behind, but simply to breathe, a slow, steady inhale that grounded her in something far more real than anything that had just unfolded, her hand resting gently as a reminder of what was ahead, something that did not require approval, did not depend on perception, something that would exist regardless of who chose to acknowledge it. And then she continued, stepping through the doors without hesitation, without announcement, because she did not need one, and behind her the room remained quiet for a second longer than expected, as if adjusting to the absence of the person who had just redefined it. And Daniel finally moved, not forward, not toward anyone, but simply shifting his stance, as if recognizing that the space he occupied was no longer the same, and no one rushed to fill the silence he left behind, because they understood something now that could not be unseen. That influence can shape a story, but it cannot replace truth once it has been spoken. And as the evening slowly resumed around him, conversation softer, more measured, Daniel stood in the center of a room that no longer revolved around him. And somewhere beyond those doors, Emily walked into a future that did not need to be announced to be real, because some endings do not arrive with noise, they arrive with clarity, and some men lose everything they built, not because someone took it from them, but because they finally revealed what it was built on.